Hello children, today I'm going to introduce John Donne and metaphysical poetry. We have a portion to study in appreciating poetry. The poem's name is Valediction Forbidding Mourning by John Donne. John Donne is a metaphysical poet born in the year 1572 in London. He is known as a metaphysical poet. We will look into the features of metaphysical poetry today. Metaphysical poetry, I can say it is a form of intellectual poetry, obscure poetry. The poets used paradoxical statements and they were learnt people. In metaphysical poetry, we have religious and amorous poems and so on. Let's get into the slides. John Donne was a metaphysical poet born in the year 1572 in London, 8 years after Shakespeare's birth. He lived in Protestant England. At that time, England followed Protestantism. King James I was the ruler and he persecuted Catholics. He studied in Cambridge and Oxford universities, but he was debarred from taking a university degree because of his Catholicism. And he penned love lyrics, religious poems, satirical verses, erotic verses. That was in 2 volumes, that is satires and songs and sonnets. But almost none of his poetry was published during his lifetime. Okay, you can see the picture of John Donne here. And you can see the building here. This is Lincoln's Inn where he studied law. And coming towards metaphysical poets, it's a term created by Samuel Johnson. You can see the picture of Samuel Johnson here. He was an 18th century English essayist, poet and philosopher. And metaphysical poets, this group, it was loosely associated group. Why it was loosely associated? Because the poets had similarities and they had also differences in their writing. That is why it is loosely associated. And the group has the members like George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Andrew Marvell, John Cleveland. Please study the names of these poets. The metaphysical poets are known for their ability. They shocked the readers. They influenced the readers with new perspectives. They gave the poetry a new look. And they used paradoxical images which are paradoxical in nature. And they used subtle arguments in their work. And they used an inventive syntax, a new syntax in poetry. And they also used imagery from art, imagery from philosophy, imagery from religion. And they also used conceit. And Donne reached beyond the rational structures of 17th century, beyond the intellectualism of 17th century through his poetry. With his clever and inventive conceits, he reached beyond the rational structures of the 17th century. Ingenious, okay, ingenious means it is inventive, clever, all those meanings you can attribute. And now comes what is conceit. I told you about conceit, which Donne and metaphysical poets used. What do you mean by conceit? See, what is simile? When you say you are like a red rose, comparing the person to a rose. And what do you mean by metaphor? You are a rose, giving the qualities of rose to the person. And what is conceit? It is an extension of metaphor, extended metaphor. Conceit is also a sort of metaphor, but it is the comparison between 2 very unlike things. 2 unlike things are compared. See, for example, in the poem of John Donne, The Flea, and here the poetry is like this. No, the summary or the analysis is like this. The speaker speaks about a flea that has bitten the speaker and his beloved. Then their blood has got mixed in the flea. When the flea bitten the poet and the beloved, the blood got mixed inside the flea. And the poet Dunn says that flea is like their marriage bed. Flea is compared to their marriage bed here. A very unreal or unlike comparison. No, how can a person compare a flea to a marriage bed? So that sort of comparisons you can see in conceit. That is what comparison between two very unlike things. So the poem we are going to study is Valediction, Forbidding Mourning. You can see their very different comparison. That is, two lovers are compared to the two legs of compass. A very unlike comparison, right? Yes. And coming back to John Donne's biography. It was a time, 17th century England was a period of theological unrest because many people followed Catholicism, many people followed Protestantism, and people were persecuted for following Catholicism as the ruler was a Protestant. Like that, theological unrest, political unrest was happening in 17th century England. And I told you in England, Catholics were persecuted. And Donne born into a Roman Catholic family, and he had a deep relation with his religion, Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. He had a personal and deep relationship. And you can see all those things in his poetry too. About his one of his poems, a hymn to God the Father. We can see he's talking towards God. And I told you about he studied in Oxford and Cambridge universities, but he was debarred to take any degree from there. And at age of 20, he studied law at Lincoln's Inn. And after that, he succumbed to religious pressure and he joined Anglican Church. Anglican Church is that it took both the elements from Catholicism and Protestantism. It was a new church. That is, in Queen Elizabeth's time, a new form of church was emerged, and that combined the elements of Catholicism and Protestantism. It was the time in the time of Queen Elizabeth. Under Queen Elizabeth, Anglicanism emerged. Okay, and he joined Anglican Church. Followed before that, his younger brother died in the prison because of his Catholic loyalties, and this actually succumbed him to religious pressure and he joined the Anglican Church. Then I told you about satires and songs and sonnets, his work in 1590s. In 1598, after returning from a 2-year naval expedition, he sailed with Earl of Essex and Walter Raleigh on colonial missions too. You can see the picture of Walter Raleigh on the bottom. And in 1598, after returning from the 2-year naval expedition, he was appointed as a private secretary to Sir Thomas Egerton. So Thomas Egerton was a nobleman, English nobleman, judge, statesman, and Lord Chancellor. And, Donne secretly married Anne More, the niece of Lady Egerton. So his wife's name is Anne More. And Donne's father-in-law, that is Anne More's father, was disapproved of this marriage, and he did not provide a dowry for the couple, and Donne briefly imprisoned also. And you can see divine poems, Pseudomartyr, were the two works of this period. And after the marriage, when His father-in-law also disapproved the marriage and did not give any dowry, and this left the couple really isolated, and they depended on friends, relatives and all. And Dunn suffered social instability because of his faith, and he also suffered financial instability. And also his financial instability deteriorated by the birth of many children. His wife died at the age of 37 after giving birth to their 12th child, and its financial instability deteriorated or worsened by the birth of many children. But he continued to write, and he published divine poems in 1607. I told you about divine poems, no? Yeah, he published divine poems in 1607. And in Pseudo-Martyr, that is, he published in the year 1610, he displayed his knowledge of the church laws, and he displayed his knowledge of his state laws, the country's law. In 1615, James I, the monarch, the King of England, pressured him to enter the Anglican ministry, that is the combination of Protestantism and Catholicism. King pressured him to enter Anglican ministry, and he was appointed royal chaplain later that year. Royal chaplain would be a member of clergy with long service, and he is to be appointed as a minister to the monarch. And Dunn was appointed as a royal chaplain. Then holy sonnets are the work of this time. In his later years, Dunn's writing reflected his fear of his inevitable death. He wrote his private prayers like devotions upon emergent occasions during a period of severe illness, and he published it in 1624. And Dunn suffered with yellow fever, that is of severe illness. And at that time he wrote devotions upon emergent occasions, and he published it in 1624. His learned preaching, his charismatic preaching, and his inventive preaching made him a very influential person in London. And he is known for his lively style, high-spirited style, and compelling style because of his metaphysical poetry. And the Dunn died in London on March 31st, 1631. So from 1572 to 1631 is his lifespan. And you can see the features of his poetry as forceful poetry or vigorous poetry. We will study the features of his poetry throughout his work for Valediction, Forbidding, Mourning. And we can see a reality of thought or powerful expression in his poetry. And he revolted against the pastoral conventions of Queen Elizabeth's time. He revolted against Elizabethan style of poetry that is easy, or pastoral convention, or the stock imageries and all. He revolted against that. And we can see a dramatic rhythm in his poetry, short lines he has used in his poetry. And it was more personal, subjective, more personal. And following poetries are his major poems, that is the Flea I introduced to you, the Canonization, and Hymn to God the Father I introduced to you, where he was speaking to the God. Then the Relic and Hymn to God the Father, it is assumed that it was written after he recovered from yellow fever. Then the Relic, the Sun Rising, Valediction, Forbidding, Mourning, these are his major poems. Yes, now we will move into metaphysical poets, metaphysical poetry features. So I told you metaphysical poets are the group of poets which got influenced from John Donne, and includes George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Andrew Marvell, John Cleveland, and so on. And now let us discuss more features about metaphysical poetry. I told you about conceits, right? And now we will move on to more features of metaphysical poetry. First one is they had a delight in new thought and expression. The metaphysical poets, all these poets, desired to say the things which had never been said before. They had new thoughts, they had unique thoughts, and they didn't care about their diction. Their thoughts were most important for them, the new way of expressing their thoughts. And the second feature is of far-fetched images. I told you in the case of conceits, they actually used dissimilar images. They actually used two different things to compare, and they used dissimilar images, which really apparently unlike, which really apparently dissimilar, that is conceits. They have used conceits, and they also used hyperbolical expressions. Andrew Marvell, another metaphysical poet, is said that he wants 100 years to praise her lover's eyes, right? 100 years to praise lover's eyes. So that is an hyperbolical expression, right? We have studied what is hyperbole, that is exaggeration, exaggerating. Then moving on to the next feature, that is obscurity. Obscurity means a difficulty. We will not be able to identify the work. We will not be able to identify the meaning because it gives an obscurity. The work as an obscurity, it is far difficult to analyze the work or particular poem. And it also had learning. That means the learning or the scholarship of the authors were projected in the poem. Metaphysical poetry reveals the scholarship of its authors. It has been said that a whole book can be created or can be compiled from the allusions of Donne and Abraham Cowley, another metaphysical poet. And the common readers, one of the criticisms was the common readers cannot understand by their poetry because learning was not frequented in those times among common people or common readers. And next feature is of religious and amorous poetry. That is, metaphysical poetry itself can be classified into two divisions of amorous poetry and religious verse. Then about complicated mental and emotional experience they have put forward in their poetry, their mental experience, their emotional experience in the poetry, and told that they have used metaphors and similes which were deliberately they were using. Okay, we can see some sort of artificiality. They thought and they wrote. It was not like of Wordsworth's poetry, which was spontaneously flowing. In Romantic period, we can see the words were spontaneously flowing, and in Elizabethan period, that the period just preceded this metaphysical poetry, the writers, we can see they were writing from the heart. Sidney or Spencer, right? They were more close to nature, and we can see a naturality in their works. But metaphysical poetry has an artificiality because the authors were trying to express their scholarship through the writing, and they deliberately used metaphors and similes and far-fetched images, conceits. And also, another feature of metaphysical poetry is that the idea was to connect physical and spiritual universe, that is, matter and soul. They were trying to connect. And we could see a shocking dramatic style in the poetry, and they used carpe diem philosophy. Carpe diem philosophy is that asking the person, or it is that to enjoy the time and don't give too much thought on the future. Same thing we can see in the poetry of metaphysical too, that Andrew Marvell asking his beloved to enjoy the present time, don't think about the future. And the poems, metaphysical poems, were highly criticized in 18th century. Samuel Johnson said, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and illusions. Their learning instructs, and their subtlety surprises. But the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and though he sometimes admires, is seldom pleased. I'll explain it. Samuel Johnson, the famous critic, who is the author of Dictionary, Johnson's Dictionary, which was in the year of 1755. And he said that, he was a critic too, and he said that the most heterogeneous ideas, or most different ideas, or diversified ideas are yoked together. I told you about the comparisons that the metaphysical poets were making. As Dunn said, a flea to a marriage bed. Like that, different and diversified ideas are yoked, are put together, and nature and art, the nature, art, are damaged for comparisons, for illustrations, and they have for indirect references, for allusions. And their learning or their poetry definitely instructs, but it never gets admired by the readers. No, I'm sorry, the reader gets admired, but they will not be pleased by the poetry. The reader will admire the poetry, but will not be pleased by the poetry. The reader will definitely admire, look into that poetry with an awe, but they will not be pleased. That is what Samuel Johnson said. This is most important, okay? The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked together. Please by heart this, okay? You can include this in your essay questions when it is asked about metaphysical poetry. And it was praised in 20th century. So 18th century, when Dryden Johnson spoke, it was a criticism, it was a scathing criticism. But in 20th century, when Herbert Grayson published a work in 1912, the name of the work is Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century. In that, he praised metaphysical poets. And Eliot reviewed this work in 1921. And he said about metaphysical poetry that it had a unification of thoughts, or unified sensibility revealed in metaphysical poetry. What do you mean by unified sensibility? That metaphysical poets had a fusion of thought and feeling. Their thoughts in the head can be seen, or can be what was associated with the feelings of the heart. The thought of the poet and the feeling of the poet was unified in the poetry. If thought is different and they cannot give that feeling to the poetry will be fragmented. But Donne and the metaphysical poets, they could unify thought and feeling. The recreation of thought into feeling can be seen in the poetry of metaphysical poets. And Eliot said that uh, in the later 17th century, we can see the dissociation of sensibility started. That is, the poets cannot unify their thought and they cannot unify their feeling. The thought and feeling unified form cannot be seen in the poetry, and it was continuing in the modern poetry too. That is what Eliot said. And before Johnson, Dryden in 1693, John Dryden, the famous Restoration playwright, Dryden applied the term metaphysics to criticize Donne and the poetry. He was the first to apply the term to 17th century poetry when in 1693 he criticized Donne. He affects the metaphysics in his amorous verses where nature should reign, and perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy when he should engage their hearts. Dryden's criticism was about the metaphysics. He affects the metaphysics. Dryden affects the metaphysics. It is a type of metaphysics poetry. Actually, nature should be the major part of the poetry, or as the earlier poets said, or earlier theorists said, we should imitate nature in art. As Aristotle said, we should imitate nature in the art. But the poetry of Donne and metaphysical poets was not like that. And Dryden said that they confuses women with philosophy, but actually the authors, what they had to do, they had to engage their hearts, but instead of that they confused philosophy in women. And the term metaphysical came from metaphysics. See, meta and physics. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy dealing with the relationship between mind and matter. Mind is really complex, right? And metaphysics is the branch of philosophy dealing with the relationship between mind and matter. Or we can say a relationship between physical world, that is the world around us, the things, matters around us. Okay, the things, that is physical world, and metaphysics dealing with the relationship between physical world and human consciousness. Mind, they were dealing with human consciousness. The physical world and human consciousness they were dealing with. So we can see the combination of the physical world around us and the combination of human consciousness or the spiritual things and all. And for this reason, metaphysics is the branch of philosophy dealing with relationship between mind and matter, I told you. And for this reason, the metaphysics poet are interested in the interplay between the world of mind and the physical world. They looked into world of mind, that can be spirit, you can say, or the soul, the interplay between or the relationship between the spirit and soul and the physical world you can see around you. And metaphysical poets gave concrete form to abstract ideas, gave a concrete form, material form to abstract things. That is, abstract things means emotions that cannot be touched. Emotions, you can say, the things that cannot be touched. So love is an abstract idea. So emotion you cannot touch, but you can just feel it, right? Yeah, metaphysical poets gave concrete form to abstract ideas through their unusual images and comparisons. They have used unusual images. And elaborated extended metaphor or analogy is known as conceit. Already we have discussed. A conceit is an unusual or surprising analogy, metaphor or simile, a kind of extended metaphor. And another feature of much metaphysical poetry, and is sometimes something that sets it apart from much other works of the period, is its colloquial speech. See, for God's sake, hold your tongue and let me move, or child, chide my palsy or my gout. This is from Donne's poem, okay? And see, a colloquial speech, you can see an abstract beginning, you can see, right? An abrupt beginning, you can see. For God's sake, hold your tongue. So till then, the world or the poetry or the poetry lovers of England didn't see a kind of poetry just starting with these beginnings, a colloquial speech or an abrupt beginning. They couldn't see. They have not seen like this. So colloquial speech, abrupt beginning are the features you can say about metaphysical poetry. And told that the term metaphysical poets was popularized by Samuel Johnson in his critical biography of the 17th century poet Abraham Cowley in Johnson's Lives of the Poets. In that work, the term metaphysical poets was popularized, but remember, first used by Dryden to give out his criticism that they were confusing the minds of women in, but actually what they had to do, they had to engage the mind, engage their hearts, but instead they were confusing women. And metaphysical poetry are highly intellectual poetry because they were learned people. I told even Donne educated in Cambridge and Oxford, but he couldn't get a degree. That is another matter. But they were learned people. And bold and ingenious conceits you can see, or highly creative, far-fetched images, highly creative or inventive comparisons you can see, and inappropriate and unsuitable imagery that is also in the poems of metaphysical poets. That I told you about the poem of Donne, The Flea, unsuitable images for the reader. Mark but this flea, and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first and now sucks thee, and in this flea are two bloods mingled be. So in flea is compared to a marriage bed here. What an unusual comparison, right, to the reader. But for the poets, it was really appropriate. And the complexity or obscurity, as we have discussed, that is a feature of metaphysical poetry. And use of paradox or contradictory statements can be seen in metaphysical poetry. And they used rigid expressions in the poetry. So these are the features of metaphysical poetry.